The following program is hosted by immature, irreverent, obnoxious, and often disgusting young men. Listener discretion is advised.
This time on Nude Clan. Chase me, Ashley Riot. Chase me!
Shall we play a game?
You got several things to do. You got work, kids in school. What do you do when it's all over?
How do you hand something from one player to another?
Dark soul light. Turn on the TV, pick up the controller and play some games with the new clan.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Nude Clan, the video game podcast that loves getting on video game translators. I am your host, Caleb Schweiss, and today we have on a guy who I've been following on Twitter for a really long time, Alexander O. Smith. I know him because I saw his name in the credits of Final Fantasy XII and Vagrant Story, and I said, that guy knows how to translate a video game. So I followed him, and honestly, I don't know why I haven't asked you to do an episode way before now, because I've been a big fan of yours ever since we got to Final Fantasy XII for my other podcast, Ultima Final Fantasy, which was probably about 5 years ago now, so it's been a long time. But yeah, I know you reside in Japan currently, and you do have your publishing company and a translation company called Bento Books. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that, your decision to move to Japan, and sort of your process. One thing we talked about before we got on the show here today was the shock to me after playing Final Fantasy X, the first voice acted Final Fantasy game, and it kind of just being zany and all over the place. There's some great performances in there for sure, but nothing compared to what I thought of Final Fantasy XII, which has an excellent translation. The world really feels alive, and the biggest thing to me that makes it feel so alive is the use of language, the use of dialect, the use of different accents for people from different areas. And I thought that was a real step up. Unfortunately, 12 also has some of the worst compression as far as the audio goes. It sounds like everybody's kind of talking through one of those little tin can things you made as a kid with the string kind of connecting the two, which to me was really odd considering the quality that went into the work. And then they're just no, we're going to crush it into the tiniest soundbite size we can. I know you also worked on Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, which is a game that I've heard a lot about and never played, so I want to talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to talk to you about what got you into translating video games. What was the big thing that started you on this path?
Hi, thanks for having me on. Lots of topics there to cover, but to start at the beginning, I was a grad student in Japanese literature, of all things, and had always been a gamer, and wasn't feeling the program that I was in, and realized that I wanted to do something else, something involving storytelling and the folklore that had kind of got me interested in the program of study I was in anyway. And so started looking around, and at that time, Squaresoft in Southern California had a posting for localization specialists. And so I cold called them, went out for an interview, and the rest is history.
Very nice. Yeah, I don't know, it's always surprising, to me anyway, there's a lot of times I've tried for something and I've been this will never work out. And then it's surprising what will happen if you actually go for it. So what year was that? How long ago has this been?
That was 98.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yep. And I think it was good timing. And at the time, especially, a lot of people in localization had just kind of wandered in. Either they had a different game in a game company and they happened to be able to speak English and Japanese, and they're like, hey, can you help us translate? There were some people like that. There were other people who had gotten in because they had aspirations to be in the game industry. They wanted to be computer graphics. They wanted to do computer graphics, or they wanted to do some other aspect of game dev. And because they were also bilingual, they kind of applied for a localization position.
Oh, yeah, kind of like a foot in the door thing.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
And some of those people ended up being great localizers, and some people ended up doing localization for a couple of years and then moving on to the thing they really wanted to do. So,
got it. What were you playing back then? What really brought you into gaming and made you decide you wanted to do localization for Japanese games?
Actually, I think the bulk of the gaming I was doing was pen and paper, Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of stuff. And I played a bunch of mainstream U.S. games like Civ and those kind of games. And way back in the day, Wizardry, Bard's Tale, the kind of classic RPGs. So that was my background in gaming, but I hadn't played much in the way of Japanese games. I mean, Zelda, I think, and obviously Mario. The standard kind of Nintendo fare. But I'd never really gone deep into any of the RPG stuff. In fact, the first time I played a Final Fantasy was when I found the listing for Squaresoft and said, what does Squaresoft do? And went and borrowed a console, because I didn't even have a console at the time. Borrowed a console from a friend, rented the game, Final Fantasy VII, which was the latest one that was out at the time, and started going through it and said, oh, yeah, I could do this.
Yeah.
And, I was just reading the English, but I obviously at that point I was already fluent in Japanese. I was I was in a PhD program for Japanese literature, so I figured I'd be able to handle the Japanese side of things. And when I saw the English, I was like, yeah, this is not going to be a problem.
Yeah. Seven's translation, I could see why you'd be like, oh yeah, I could do this. There's a few times in there where you're like,
well,
to
be totally fair, it was essentially one guy, and he had very little time to do that. So it's impressive, how they got made at all.
Yeah, I imagine that's the case. And I know Square is kind of infamous for just deciding. I'm sure there's a lot that goes into it, but they're like, well, this one's Final Fantasy 1, and then this one's 3, but really it's 6. But we didn't get anybody on it until now. And then now here's 7, which is so like it's weird to me because in US, Final Fantasy 3 is 3, and then we got Final Fantasy 4 where they kind of got it together, and it was like, okay, now they're both out. And then FF5 took forever to come out here, and then it went to 7 again. So it's funny they went to such great lengths to like renumber it to make us feel like we're getting a fair deal, but then at the end they're like, all right, screw it, it's 7. It's 7, and then from now on we'll be good. We'll get you guys the games. And it's funny because I can totally see it being one guy for 7, and obviously the credits tell us it's one guy, which is really unfortunate because it's a game that has like to me it has a really rich story. There's a lot there that you can mine from, but there's a lot of things that don't really come across in the game. There's character deaths that I watch that happen apparently that didn't happen, and then I watch the Advent Children movie and I'm like, wait a minute, wasn't that guy dead? And then I go back and I dive into the internet and I was like, oh no, he's not dead. The translation was just kind of wonky in this one spot, so I just assumed he like died off screen, but really he was still alive. And
I'm sure it'll get its fair shake in the remake that's coming out now.
Yeah, and it kind of has been. It's just funny that because like sometimes I'll get all up in arms about certain changes, and then I'll go and look and be like, oh no, that's what they wanted in the beginning. It just didn't quite work out for whatever reason. And part of it could be me too, with the passage of time, just forgetting what exactly happened in Final Fantasy VII. So
it's the same writer for the remake. So I guess you can kind of think of it as a director's cut.
Yeah. I guess you could. Yeah, it's super long compared to the original one, and
Also like a director's cut.
yeah. So cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I actually, one of my favorite games ever is probably Civilization 5. I don't know if you played that one, but
Yeah. I think just as an age thing, I mean, Civ 2 was the one that I probably. Oh no, I'm sorry. Civ 2 and Civ 4 were the ones that I spent the longest amount of time on.
Yeah,
but they're all pretty good.
I know. I tried to get into 6, me and my buddy, but I was like, I don't know. I always turn on the turn timer because we tend to get kind of lengthy in our turn times, and I think that's what messed up Civ 6 for me. Is I was kind of rushing in. We didn't get time to figure out the game, and I just fell back into my, in 5 this is a lot better. It's because I played it for like 200 hours and I really understood the game, so might not have given it a fair shake.
Those games reward that kind of deep dive. Like the more you put into it, the more you get out of it.
Yeah, there's nothing quite like getting satellites in like 1820. Like, yes.
Right.
Yeah, so cool. That's a good way. That's a good entry point into the series. I mean, Final Fantasy VII. That's the first one I played too as a kid.
I think it's the first one that a lot of people played in the U.S. at least as kids, which is why it was such a big deal when they announced the remake, because this was for a lot of people their starting point with the series.
Right. Yeah. Have you played the remake at all?
I haven't.
Oh, okay. What's keeping you from it? Do you just not play very many games now, or are you just kind of afraid? Or
I think I'm NDA'd from telling you the real reason why.
Oh, okay.
I haven't played it yet, so I'll just skip that. But yeah, I'll eventually. I'll get there someday.
Oh, okay. So now it's got a nice shroud of mystery on it there.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem with games. It's like, so what you working on? Stuff.
Yeah. Nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah.
I am not, however, working on Final Fantasy VII. I don't want to give, or the remake. I don't want to give that impression. But
oh, okay.
Just complicated arrangements with former clients, kind of thing.
Gotcha. Yeah. There's one thing that that universe, the Final Fantasy VII universe, has. It's massive complications. I mean, there's multiple games in that like, I almost said trio of games. I guess it is kind of with that Dirge of Cerberus and Crisis Core. There's like a million music right problems that are going on. Sure. So it's like, on one hand, they'll never remake the other two, but to me, on the other hand, they don't really have to. They could just include all that stuff in the remake, which I would be very surprised kind of if they didn't, or at least altered it to a more manageable and modern take on those concepts that were explored in those games. But we'll see. They've got plenty of time. All right, so you applied for it. What were you working on in the beginning, if you can even talk about it?
I can talk about that. Sure. I kind of cold called them. Well, it's not a cold call, I guess, if you're responding to a help wanted ad, but called them up, did the interview, ended up working at Squaresoft in Costa Mesa, California, which is where it was now. I think it's moved a little further north now. The LA office, they're right up next to the airport these days. But back then it was in Costa Mesa, and I was living in Irvine, which is where Blizzard is located.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah, a big game development central down there. And worked there through the rest of '98, which I think it was maybe 4 or 5 months. I think I probably joined them at the end of the summer, and so like 4 or 5 months there. And then on January 1st, 99, transferred to the Tokyo office, which was in Meguro, Tokyo. And I had started in California. I'd started working on Final Fantasy VIII, I guess was the first game I worked on. And a little bit on one of the Chocobo Dungeon games, but maybe I was just editing. It was a long time ago, so I don't remember all the details, but you could probably check credits and find my name on some of those things. I remember having something to say about Chocobo Dungeon and 2, I think it was, and one other game, maybe Brave Fencer Musashi, something like that. But the main game that I was on was Final Fantasy VIII, and I was in charge of the Laguna Loire sections, which was kind of that dream sequence within the story.
Right.
Yeah, and ultimately, I don't know what of my material got through to the final game, because I was just translating and then handing it off to an editor, to another translator, and I didn't get to see that game through to the end because I transferred to Japan, and FFA was being handled entirely in the U.S. So the localization part, as far as I know. So, but that was fun. It was sort of like my intro to the whole routine, and I've mentioned this in other places before, but it was really the dark ages of localization still at Square, where they didn't have access to all the files, and they were using Game Sharks to go in, and Game Shark being this little device that you put in between your PlayStation and a VHS deck, so you can hack into your own game and then record it on VHS, because we didn't have original game files, text files, and so in order to follow the text or do any work in advance of getting those files, we had to use something like a Game Shark to record sequences, which was a little primitive and a little crazy, but that's how it was done. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I've heard that about Final Fantasy VIII before. Like the reason why it took them so long to port the game, and this is kind of I don't know if this was. I guess it sounds like it was probably what happened, is they didn't have the the script for the game. They had to go back and reverse engineer the game basically. And to me, I was hearing that, I was like, "What are you talking about? You don't have your code. You don't have the game." And apparently they didn't. So this makes a lot of sense.
It was probably only a month delay or something, but given the tight schedules everyone was on, it was sort of well, we have to wait a few weeks for this thing, or for some reason it's getting held up. Ultimately, they did get the files, and we were putting stuff in the files. Before I left, I'm pretty sure that I was working in original files.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was just some sort of weird administrative delay. It may have been the first large game that they did. Definitely the first large game that they did in the States, instead of doing it in-house, because FF7 had been done in Japan. So.
Right. Yeah.
So, and then I transferred to Tokyo, and the first job I was given was sort of understudy on Vagrant Story, and the lead translator on that was a guy named Endo Sho, and he, Japanese guy, obviously. He had never been to the States or any English-speaking country. He learned English entirely by listening to NHK radio, just sort of the public radio.
Oh, wow.
Which is amazing. And he had a job as an editor at a computer magazine called ASCII before that. But he was in charge of translation. He was actually very, very good for having never been to the States. But the team for Vagrant Story, and this was very, very early on in the Vagrant Story dev cycle too, but they had asked for some sort of intro scroll for the game, and they wanted it to be done biblically, in a sort of classical style kind of thing. And he showed me his rough translation that he'd done, and I'm seeing this and going, "Oh my gosh!" Because it was English, but obviously it wasn't. You can imagine.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite up to the standard that I think the team was expecting, and so I was sort of just started wrangling with both sort of a personal crisis of, oh boy, what have I got myself into, and because I was assigned to be sort of his understudy, and then the other thing was well, how do I fix this, or how do I make sure that the game comes out nicely, and then. The game was actually put on hold, or the localization was put on hold for temporarily to wait for dev to catch up or something. And the person who was in charge of localization on Parasite Eve 2 actually left the company for personal reasons. And so I took over Parasite Eve 2 midstream and switched off of Vagrant Story, which was kind of dormant at the time anyway. And ended up working on Parasite Eve 2, which was being run down in Osaka mainly, because the team working on that had essentially been poached from the Biohazard team.
Oh, really? Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And
actually,
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say a lot of the decisions on Parasite Eve 2, like, no voice was a big one, and that was because they didn't want it to feel too much like Biohazard.
Yeah, man, I got a rough history with Parasite Eve 2, I'll tell you that. I really liked the first one, and then the second one is like to me, it was miserable. I don't know. Mostly gameplay-wise, though. Like, there's parts of
Sure.
like,
yeah, I only have vague memories of it, honestly, so it didn't leave a huge impression on me. But
that's for the better. Mine are very real, very, very bad. That's interesting, though. Yeah, that's cool. And yeah, it does feel like, definitely feels like a Resident Evil game, so that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Which is an interesting switch from like a weird interactive RPG style to straight up survival horror with, a couple RPG elements peppered in there to make everyone a little happy.
Yep.
Cool.
The director of that game is still a good friend, though, and we've worked on several things together over the years. He moved on from Square, years ago, but he was at DNA for a while and working on mobile games there, and so I had a writing gig that sort of he sort of gave me the keys to for them for a while, and did a lot of localization for them as well. So we've had fun since then.
Oh, that's good. Sweet. So you moved on from there. You did some Parasite Eve. When did you get back to Vagrant Story?
It must have been almost a year later, because I remember working on Vagrant Story early in the year in 2000, I guess. Does that make sense? I forget when it came out, but
yeah, it was. I know it was in somewhere around there.
Right. Yeah. No, actually, it was definitely early 2000 that I was working on it, because I remember I just got separated from my wife. Wow. That was the backdrop to Vagrant Story. If it seems dark, that's where that came from.
Yeah, the first line in there is the "chase me, Ashley Riot" part, which made me laugh pretty hard. So,
right,
it didn't start off
true.
dark, but you are
That's
underground
true.
for most of the game, so I guess
true that. So, boy, by the time that I got off Parasite Eve 2, I think things had shifted around in the office, and Endo-san was on a different game at that point. And so I kind of walked into Vagrant Story, which ended up for the best, because we ended up having, Endo-san ended up being much better suited for the stuff that he was working on. And I felt more at home doing the Vagrant Story stuff than the Parasite Eve stuff.
Yeah, that was one of the surprising ones for me. I know it came out in like 2000, but when I did play it, it's probably been like 2.5, 3 years maybe now. When I played it for the show, I was actually fairly impressed with it, and I was like, man, like what did they do to this game? Like, I don't understand what's going on in the story. I don't know what it is about that game that, like, the way it's told, that I was just like not quite sure what the hell I was looking at, I guess. But I remember being very impressed with the style of speech and the writing, which is, to me, interesting for a Squaresoft title from that time frame, because there's, like I said, there's 3 years before that, there's Final Fantasy VII, which, you did say it was one guy that did it all, but it's not a game that's known for, like, oh man, excellent translation, great writing per se.
Right.
Really good story, but kind of muddled down by those things, to be honest. And then a few years later, we get this random title that's not even that big of a game, Vagrant Story, and it's like masterful, in my opinion. I was like really impressed with it. And I think that was honestly when I first found you, because I was like, who did this game? And then I go through you and your partner in crime, as you said earlier, and I was like, no, it's these guys. They did this, and they did the other game that I think is excellent as far as like Japanese to English in the series FF12, and so I was like, okay, that makes sense. Both Ivalice games, although it sounds like they weren't planning on that per se, unless maybe they were later. I don't know, but
I mean, yeah, that's all between Matsuno, who's the writer of the original game, and Square. So I can't comment on their awareness of the Ivalice idea at different times during the course of that project. But I know, I mean, they had an Ivalice bit on Final Fantasy XIV recently, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah. And to me, it was always kind of funny because Ivalice, the way they talk about it in like Final Fantasy Tactics, I don't know. It seems like they kind of just like decided that it's all going to be in the same world, even though it kind of feels like it's not. But at the same time, it doesn't really matter.
Sure.
I can't remember what it was. It's like Ivalice is a country or something in one of them, and then it's like the world in another one. I can't quite remember, but I was like, all right, whatever. I'm sure they just decided it was cool later on, and it works.
To me, it's more of the Matsuno brand than an actual location or place that has a coherent history or something like that.
That makes sense. That makes more sense to me.
Which makes it very similar to Final Fantasy, which is obviously not a series in the sense of a continuous story that carries characters and plot lines from one thing to another. It's not even in the same world or the same time, but it does share DNA.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so I think that even more than that, Ivalice, the different games share DNA, and often that common DNA is either Matsuno himself writing or somebody writing in the style of Matsuno.
I see. That makes sense.
And that's another big reason for the difference in the game itself as it's experienced even in English, I think, because when you come in as a translator, you are trying to a large extent, realize the original game's vision in a different language. And so your task is very different. If you've got a FF7 or FF8 or a Vagrant Story, you're getting a very different kind of game, very different kind of story, very different kind of characters. And every aspect of the game is going to influence how the localization turns out and what the translators are aiming for. So even putting this writer was really good, or this writer is really bad, or this translator is really good, putting all that aside, the different games sort of demand different kinds of stories. And so, that's a big difference too. Final Vagrant Story should feel very different than Final Fantasy VII.
Right.
Everything else aside. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what makes it hard that's what kind of makes it hard on my end to decide what's really making the bacon here. Yeah. Because you're right.
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a black box. I mean, obviously, I know who did what, but and I think that you can generally tell based on if you play enough games in that genre, or you play enough games by one person. It might be a little difficult with Matsuno because I did end up translating so much of his output for many years. But you can check, like the Final Fantasy Tactics Ogre. The original release of that was translated well before I even got to Square, and then we did a remake, and so that's a retranslation, and that retranslation was done by myself and Joe Reeder. So that's a pretty good baseline if you want to just get the difference. Generally speaking, Matsuno's writing fairly straightforward. It's more about the content of the story than the style. So things that feel stylistic are added on, and also anything that deals with wordplay or that kind of thing, that's not really done in Japanese, not the same way, at least. So that's more of an add-on.
Nice. Yeah, I imagine whenever I think about translation and translations over time, I mean, there's a lot of places that get a lot of things that get a bad rap, like a lot of people talk about the King James version, they changed stuff. and this and that and the other. And I'm like, well, you would kind of have to change stuff, because to me, this is just looking from the outside, a guy that barely speaks any other language other than English, just a little bit of German, a little bit of Spanish, and like 5 Japanese words that I can remember. To me, it's not merely just translating it directly. You know, if you're trying to, you know, with something like the Bible or something like even one of these video games, you're trying to tell a story. And so it's more about, and this is something I read about what you do. You kind of take what they originally said and you kind of play with the ideas of what they're trying to get at, and then you make it make sense in English, which it's not, you know, like changing it per se. It is changing it, but it's making it work within a different language that has like a different setup. You know, like if you want to tell a joke, you can directly translate that joke, but if the joke isn't going to be funny in English at all or make any sense in English, it's like, well, why tell that joke? Why not just alter it to something else that makes sense within the scenario that's going on in the game and make it something that the end user can actually enjoy? So what is your process like for stuff like that? I imagine you probably ran into that a lot. I mean, you mentioned that just barely, that there are things that, like in Japan, there's like differences with speech that like don't really come through, and you felt that you needed to kind of alter it to make it work for English. So what makes you, like, what's your process when you do something like that?
Well, there's kind of 2 ways to think about it. One is to think about it from the way you were just describing it, which is kind of how you think about it when you're in the trenches, which is like, here's the Japanese. How do I make this make sense in English? Because that's sort of your task for every game, for every chapter, for every line is, you know, how do I make this work in English? If you take a step back and look at it from the other side, you can also ask the question, how do I duplicate, or maybe duplicate is a bad word, recreate the experience of this game? Or even more granularly, how do I recreate the experience of this scene or even this line for certain lines, so that a gamer playing the game in English will have the same moment and the same feels and the same experience that a Japanese gamer had? And if that's your goal, then I think it becomes very clear that sometimes things do have to change, because, like you said, if you just translate a joke directly, then, you know, say there's a joke about, and this, I forget the game, but this has definitely happened. There'll be a joke about a pickled plum, which is a pretty standard thing that you eat in Japan, not a standard thing that you eat in the States. And so the joke is about a pickled plum, blah, 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 blah. And then you translate it directly and it just doesn't make any sense. It's sort of like, well, that, you know, I don't know why they said that. And that's not recreating the experience of the original, because the English gamer now is confused. Likewise, if you sit down and you say, oh, by the way, pickled plums are funny because they're really sour and kids don't like it when they get it in their bento, you know, you go in and you're like, explain this whole thing, then you're also failing to recreate the original experience, because the original game did not sit down and explain. You know, it wasn't a cultural primer on Japanese bento recipes. You know, so that's also doing a disservice to the original if you look at it from that sort of like end experience viewpoint. So the trick is to kind of keep that end experience in mind while deconstructing the original, because you want to, it's not just about, sometimes it's not even about like, what joke can I replace this with? It's like, how do I keep the overall humor of this game in the same sort of place? You know, if it's a goofy game, how do I keep it goofy? If it's a serious game, how do I keep it serious? And sometimes you can't have a joke in the same place that the original had it. You'll have to slide one in someplace else. And that's why, I mean, a lot of games will go to memes and sort of like, you know, current jokes and that kind of thing. And that might feel like a bit of a disconnect. But that's always a choice that you have to make. It's sort of like, well, if the original is relying on, you know, sort of gamer speak or like current internet speech, then maybe it's more appropriate to use sort of current, internet memes or, shorthand or whatever is popular at the time. So that's not going to matter for a game like Vagrant Story, which is set in a medieval period. But the same considerations come into play because, say for Vagrant Story, you have a bunch of people talking in Japanese. They're just talking in standard modern Japanese because it's a European setting. And it would be really weird in Japanese to have them all talking like they're a samurai, because that would be a very, a huge disconnect, right? So they speak in modern Japanese, and in fact, they use very modern words in the Japanese. But if you transpose that into what is clearly supposed to be sort of a faux medieval European setting, it becomes very disconcerting. Whereas it was not disconcerting in the original. So from that end experience viewpoint, if you don't go in there and change the modern Japanese to something that feels like it's more of the world and more of that, that European medieval setting, then you're doing a disservice to the original. So that's where you find yourself sort of saying, well, maybe this should sound a bit more Shakespearean, or maybe that kind of wordplay is more appropriate here, even though it's not in the original. And as long as you are keeping the essence of those characters the same, I think that you're fine. As long as it's always being inspired by the original, that's a really important goalpost too.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess that wouldn't really make sense for them to be. Yeah, I could see that being a weird disconnect. Also, never heard of a pickled plum in my life, so that's it's good.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's many things that need to get changed, and it's never. I mean, I think a lot of people, especially when they're learning Japanese or they're thinking about localization, they think, "Oh, yeah, what about those lines that are impossible to translate?" That kind of thing. And that's not the problem. There's no like one line that's impossible to translate. You have to be writing a game in English, essentially, heavily inspired by the original.
Yeah, it almost seems like you're coming in to do it's like one of those video game movies where like the first guy is like threw his hands up in the air and is like, I'm done, I'm not doing this anymore. And then you have to come in and like sort of do a rewrite, where it's like, well, I got to make it work because half of the movie is already made or they're already working on all this. So I want to keep the original idea, but I'm going to do my own little version of it.
Yeah, actually, adaptation is a great way to think about it, because it's very, very similar to adapting. Somebody made a book, and now you're adapting it to a movie. And obviously things are going to change.
Yeah,
there's a lot of similarities there.
That makes it make a lot more sense in my mind, for sure. Do you remember anything that happened in Vagrant Story? Like, has it been too long, or... I mean, did you...
I remember some things.
Okay. I remember some things, too, and I probably played it way more recently than you. I had no idea what's going on there, for the most part, but...
Oh, yeah, I don't know if I'd be able to help you around, like, plot holes or,
I don't know if there's stuff. Even holes. I think the hole is in my head, like, as far as understanding what was going on, but I was like, no, it's a really cool battle system, and I like the Shakespearean style of it, so gets a thumbs up for me. No idea what happened, but good stuff.
Right. Well, maybe there's a short script out there somewhere you can read. I'm sure there is. Online.
Yeah. I'll probably forget it even if I read it. But all right. So you worked on that. Let's see. I know you worked on Tactics Advance 2 as well, right? Is that what I was reading? I think I remember seeing that. I actually really like that game.
FFTA 2, both of those.
Oh, I know. Okay, so I know there's a change in Tactics Advance, and I guess A2 is the official name for the second one. And someone gave us grief on the Final Fantasy show because we referred to it as Advance 2, even though it's not on the Advance. And I was like, well, I mean, I guess that's fair, but I don't know what else the A would stand for, in my opinion. But well, I know there was a change in the original to the English version of Tactics Advance, and it was the dad. And the dad in the original one, I think, was supposed to be like an alcoholic and like just kind of like a terrible dad. And in the English version, he just seemed kind of like, I don't know. He was just kind of like a loser. I don't know how else to describe it. Was that something that you changed within the game? Like, did you try to make it a little lighter in tone, or
Did they? Yeah, that sounds vaguely familiar. I don't remember exactly what happened. That wouldn't have been my call. I think that would have been a marketing decision.
Yeah, that's fair.
From the U.S. branch, and that's actually a distinction that gets lost a lot on in the halls of Twitter and stuff, which is a lot of decisions like we can't have an openly drunk character because we need this rating, and the U.S. is more strict about it, or maybe it's not even the U.S. Maybe it's like Germany. They've got different rules about showing blood, showing guns, all these sort of things. If you're going for specific ratings, especially then, and especially on that platform too. Now, obviously, I think a lot more goes, but there's always at different moments in time considerations, or maybe there was a big kind of Christian backlash to something that happened in a game that was released the year before, and they're like, we don't want to go through that, so we're going to cut this, and this. And those are marketing decisions. There's a big brouhaha kind of connected with the whole Gamergate thing about the beach volleyball game where in the original Japanese there was like a lot more skin showing, and they covered them up. They covered the models up more for the American version. There was a very small but vocal minority going, "Hey, you're censoring our games," that kind of thing.
Yeah,
and bashing the translators for that, or localization for that. It's actually purely a marketing decision.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. I feel like that guy at the fan festival that's like, which Final Fantasy is your favorite? And the guy up there that's a voice actor for one of the games is like, I my thing is actually voice acting. It's not really gaming, so
right.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Gamergate, that's another one of those things that like I remember it happening, and I remember being like fairly confused by what was going on, and then just being like, whatever. I don't know what this is, so I'm just gonna like not worry about it. So I honestly have no idea to this day what exactly it was. I know there was like a bunch of bullying, and like there was a lot of it seems like a very broad thing of just people being mad about gaming and like practices and things like that. And I feel like it's kind of spilled out into all of these things that are going on with Blizzard and all these other companies that are having these major backlashes from fan bases for various reasons, good or bad. And again, from the outside on Twitter, it's like it might seem real bad, and then honestly, we probably have no idea what exactly is going on, because people just get up in arms over pretty much anything on there.
That is true.
Yeah, and you only ever hear one side generally, because Blizzard's just like, meh, we're not going to say anything. So it's hard to make heads or tails of pretty much any of those things that go on. But that's okay. That makes sense. They would cut that. I could see why they would cut that here, I suppose.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't remember what the specific decision was, but there is a certain realm of things that you can affect or directly influence as a localizer, but a lot of the content issues are out of our hands, or end up being something that we do, but it's at direction from the publishing, which is it's their product,
right?
Their call. So.
Yeah. What? How do you feel about those like discussions of like censorship? I never played the beach volleyball game or whatever the hell it is.
Well, I mean it's pretty silly. Like, first of all, there's a great story about this the Italian author who was also a very avid translator, Umberto Eco. He wrote The Name of the Rose, the original novel, and there's a probably apocryphal tale about him sitting in his office, and one of his colleagues came in with an American book that Umberto Eco translated into Italian, and said, you destroyed this book. You ripped out its soul and stomped on it, and I'll never forgive you for what you did to this book. Complaining about the translation that he'd done into Italian. And the response that Umberto was supposed to have given was he pointed at the original English novel on his shelf and said, "No, I didn't do anything to it. It's right there. It's totally fine. You know, you're taking issue with the translation that I wrote, but the original is fine." And so that's really the answer to anyone who's got a complaint about the translation. You know, sorry if it's not, you know, if it didn't maintain all of the pickled plum jokes, or, you know, if the nudity wasn't to your liking. Or lack thereof, rather, wasn't to your liking. But the original's there. You can, by all means, play it. And if you want sort of the original, you know, Japanese language experience, by all means, learn Japanese. Go play the game. It's right there. We haven't done anything to it. So,
yeah,
you know, the product wasn't meant for you, I think is the answer to that.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it's weird. Now it feels like there's almost an expectation that it is made for you, and if it's not perfect, it's like you've been betrayed. I don't know what it is. It's like a weird thing. And maybe
if you're feeling betrayed over a video game release, then maybe you need to just go for a walk.
Yeah, like you should look for other outlets.
Get some fresh air.
I know there was this thing that even a couple of my co-hosts got mad about. It was like Devil May Cry 5. Like there was less lower back of the chick character. I can't even remember her name when she was undressing, and I was like, really? She was like, oh, they're censoring the game, and I'm like, well, you know, I hate censorship, but like, really, come on, that's not the censorship that I hate. I hate, like, you know, suppressing speech. And I don't know if seeing someone's like lower back is like a suppression of my, you know, of free speech and all of this. And I'm like, you know, and then the justification was, well, in The Last of Us, we saw that horrendous sex scene, and then we don't get to see her lower back in that. And I was like, well, as much as I don't really like The Last of Us 2 for many reasons, like, to me that makes more sense story-wise, as opposed to just like, oh, here's this chick's lower back as she gets dressed, or like, you know, an emotional interplay between two major characters and like a big thing that happens. Like, I can see allowing the nudity more in a scene like that, whereas the other one is kind of like throwaway nudity. And like whether or not I agree with whether or not I agree with the artistry of, you know, The Last of Us 2 scene is kind of besides the point to me, because it's like, well, I can see where you would make an exception for that as like a piece of art, you know, as I swirl like, you know, some nice scotch in my glass, like this is art. Whereas the other one is just like for fun.
Right.
But yeah, that's totally up to Sony though. I remember people getting riled up about that, and I was just like, man, you guys get mad at the weirdest stuff, I swear. Because I didn't play Devil May Cry 5 and be like, where's the rest of her? Like, where is it?
Right.
You know, it was just like a 2-second thing. All right, so you worked on that stuff. I want to get into, let's keep going through your career at Square. I definitely want to get to the Final Fantasy 12 stuff, because that's where I'm like super stoked.
Right. Well, so Vagrant Story and all that happened while I was still an employee of Square. And Vagrant Story, incidentally, the translation was myself and Amanda Katsurada did a lot of the menu systems, as I recall. So she did part of the translation there. And then she was another localizer. And then really important contribution from Rich Amtower, who was the editor on Vagrant Story and has gone on to be one of the pillars at Treehouse, the Nintendo localization crew in Seattle. So big shout out to Rich Amtower, because he was as much as of an influence on the style and the writing of that game as I was. And a lot of stuff, and this is a constant theme by choice in my career, is that collaborating with people is by far my favorite way to go about work. And I'm always happier with the final product when it's something that I've been able to completely share with somebody else and, go back and forth. And I have some of the original files for Vagrant Story, and you can just see all the comment threads down below, because we actually didn't have, I think we just started using instant messaging, IQ Messenger or something like that. This is the real dark days of the web, but most of our back and forth was done asynchronously as text file comments that were on a shared server. So you can see that sort of thread below the actual text of the game, where we're arguing over like bowgun, 1 word, 2 words, that kind of thing.
Nice.
So yeah, a big shout out to Rich for his work on that. And I left Square. I quit being an employee at Square in 2002 after having done Final Fantasy X, which was also me, and another guy, Aziz Hinosta. And what else did I do? Oh, I was working on Final Fantasy 11. I had started 11 and worked about a year on that, I think, the year after FF10 wrapped, and then left the company, immediately started working for Square again as an outsourcer. And the next big project that I came back for was as an editor or an ADR writer, which is writing for lip flaps to sync up to the original, to sync the English performance to the original Japanese lip flaps on Final Fantasy X-2. And that's the first game that I worked with. There was 2 translators on that, Brian Gray and Joseph Reeder, who were both employees of Square at the time. And so I was working with both of them. And that was the first game that I worked with Joe on. And, we hit it off. And then a couple years later, when it came time to put together a crew for Final Fantasy 12, and Matsuno had, contacted me years before it actually started to say, yeah, I'd love to, get you back on that. And so that was sort of set, but it was obvious that I couldn't do it by myself in the time frame. And it's a pretty massive game. So I said, hey, well, you've still got this guy, Joe, on staff at Square. Can we use him? And so Joe and I were basically the team for FF12.
Nice. Excuse me. Nice. Yeah, I've got my Joe partner in crime too. That's the name of the co-host for the Final Fantasy show, actually.
Nice. Yeah, Joe's are great.
Yeah, love Joe's. Man, yeah. I guess the thing with Final Fantasy X, it's probably the biggest disconnect. It's not so much the writing as like the voice cast. Like I feel like it was like the first time doing a Final Fantasy game with voice acting, and to me it's really disconjointed when you got like you got 2 people from the same village and they kind of sound totally different, but I think that's just kind of like first foray, and it's just, oh yeah, this guy's a big voice actor, this guy's great, this guy plays Bender, so let's get him, all sorts of stuff like that. But
yeah, there's a lot of firsts on the Japanese side as well for that game. And the fact that they just voiced the entire thing. Like, most of the stuff that was voiced in FF10 would not have been voiced on later Final Fantasies, like kind of bit NPC dialogue and stuff like that.
Yeah, it did. There is a pretty big cast of like voice acting characters.
Huge.
Yeah, it's very.
And that's impressive. A whole other. The production of that game is a whole other story. It's kind of a miracle that it got made at all. I ended up rewriting most of that script as we were recording.
Oh, really?
The night before. Yeah, the night before every day of recording, I would rewrite everything for the next day, kind of thing.
Did you put the Macarena joke in there then?
Yeah, I think that arises naturally in the studio, and we went with it.
Nice. Yeah, that's always like. That's probably the moment I laughed the hardest at a Final Fantasy game, because it's just so like fourth wall breaking. It's just Makalani and Temple.
Yeah, I think in retrospect, I wouldn't do that now. But yeah, whatever.
Hey man, I love it.
it's just a game.
Yeah. I know. There's plenty of times where I look back on like stuff I've done, in the past, like podcasts, and been like, I wish I wouldn't have done that, but it's too late.
If you don't, then you're not. Then you're doing something wrong.
Yeah. I noticed you also wrote the lyrics to Otherworld for that game.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. How was that? I mean, what's the Is it essentially the same as it was in Japanese, or did you have to like alter it? Like, how does it go? For
No,
the
there
song?
was no Japanese.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah, it's original English lyrics.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it's not. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
That was just sort of they gave me the vibe. Actually, I don't think they even gave me a vibe. They're just like, this will be a song. Write something. And one kind of fun side story there is that, they give you he had the general music. It just been done on MIDI. It wasn't like, professionally orchestrated or anything. Just sort of a guide track. And to say where they wanted the words to go, they had a little kind of a low tone beeping. So it'd be like boo, 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 that kind of thing.
Mm.
And just to give a general idea of the rhythm of where the words would go. And they said I could mess with it as I wanted to, but there's just a general idea because there was no sheet music or anything. And so the funny thing is that there's this section in the middle where it's probably like the middle 8 or something, where there was it was actually supposed to be a solo. And they had a bass line, which in the MIDI bass line sounded just like the beep for where lyrics go. And so that's the section where there's like this, there's this guy going like, the guy's like, go into the sound of the dust of the light, and then you hear a voice in the background also announcing at the same time. There wasn't supposed to be any words there at all, but they liked the vibe of it. It was supposed to just be a bass line basically, but they liked the vibe of stuff that I wrote for it. So we ended up recording it. And they, but the singer, who was sort of like this death metal guy, who was working in Tokyo, just completely hilarious, like amazing energy in the studio. But he didn't have he couldn't really do the sort of Limp Bizkit, like hard rock rap stuff, for better or for worse. And so he had trouble with the rhythm on that section. And so we ended up having him just kind of roar and do his thing, but not really on time. And then to give it that sense of rhythm, it's my voice actually, kind of in an announcer voice, like talking in the background there, so you can kind of hear me through the noise of the performance.
Oh yeah, that is true. Yeah, I'm thinking back to the song, and yeah, that is you though, huh? Wow, cool.
Yeah. So yeah, that was fun. Every once in a while they let me write my own stuff. But I didn't really start writing professionally, getting paid specifically to write until I started working for Wizards of the Coast many years later, on Magic the Gathering.
Oh, ooh, nice. I saw you also wrote Melodies of Life, or worked on that as well for Final Fantasy IX.
Yeah, that was more of a translation.
Oh, okay.
In fact, it was a retranslation or an edit of a translation. They had the woman who did the English version for the Final Fantasy VIII Eyes on Me translation. Yeah, the woman who had done the English lyrics for that also did the lyrics for 9.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, and but there was somebody somewhere said that that it should be changed, or they wanted a review or something, and so I ended up coming in and kind of doing a brush up on her lyrics for that. So that was a very collaborative. I mean, it's all very collaborative. It's very rare in games, unless you're one guy making Stardew Valley all by himself. It's very rare to have something that isn't a deeply collaborative effort. So
yeah, it's probably weird to be like given credit for all the stuff, and you're like, well, I mean, yeah, but we also worked with all these other guys too. So to be fair,
yeah, and I think that one real sort of superpower to have in game dev is to know who to collaborate with and to know how to collaborate. And that's why you'll see a lot of game directors they'll end up making stuff with the same people, because once something clicks, you really want to hold on to that.
Yeah, that's something I've noticed with the Final Fantasy series over the years. It seems like like when you have Ito directing a game, it seems like the team has like a very similar vision, and they have like certain things that they always focus on. They're like, no, we're going to do something really cool with the level up system, or we're going to do like if you look at like Final Fantasy 6 to Final Fantasy 9, they're like, okay, well, this one you're going to get abilities from the summons, and then they're like, okay, well, this one you're going to get abilities from the items, and it's going to be like a little more tweaked and a little more advanced. And so it does kind of feel like that from the outside looking in as well. Like there's certain groups of people that will make a game kind of a certain way almost. And luckily 12 is one of Ito's beasts, and I think that's why it's so fun to play. That's awesome though. We actually, I don't know if you know the metal band Megadeth, but me and my buddy, mostly my co-host, he's the musical guy. We've done like 4 or 5 Megadeth versions of songs, and Melodies of Life is one of them that he like retooled completely as like a Megadeth track. I love it. Yeah.
Nice. It sounds like fun.
The other big one that he did was Eyes on Me from Final Fantasy VIII, and then we did some 10-2 stuff and FF10. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with some of the vocal tracks in the Final Fantasy games. Because for a while I was just like, I don't know, it doesn't really fit. And then we get to ones like 13 where it's just like an actual pop song, and I'm like, well, I guess it fits better than the pop song, but I don't know. So it's always been kind of a weird area for me with the games.
I really liked the singing in Final Fantasy X, the main theme.
Yeah, Suteki Dene. Yeah.
Yeah, by Ricky.
I'm probably slaughtering the.
That's fine. We've heard worse.
Yeah. We did that. We did a Megadeth version of that one too. It's pretty fun.
Nice.
Yeah.
That rocked.
Yeah. So cool. Let's see. What? So I know you said you went kind of independent for a while, and still came back to Square, which seems to be common, especially around this era. You know, there was a lot of inner strife at Square Enix, and like, I guess a little later than what you left, like right around FF12's release, it was just this nightmare thing where half of the company, left because Sakaguchi basically had enough. Which whatever happened there, I had no idea. It wasn't there, but. He left. Half of the company kind of left with him, and then it was sort of left in disarray. And then I think even Nobuo Uematsu, he also became independent, kind of around the same time.
It was around then. Yeah, Dog Gear Records. Split off.
Yeah. So
I mean, a lot of the sort of old guard, and I think. Part of it is just because you get more flexibility that way. In fact, for me, it was just way easier to work with Square from the outside than from the inside. You do have to do your time and sort of the boot camp because it's a great way to meet people and to make those connections. But I think then once you understand how things work on the inside and you've made those connections, that there's just so much to be said for getting on the outside, and it gives you better access. Oddly, to people that you wouldn't have had access to before, like directors, people like that. Yeah.
To me, it's more like they're your customer now, so it's like there's a different dynamic there as opposed to they're your
very
boss.
Much so.
Yeah,
absolutely, and there's a lot of power too in being called in from the outside as a quote unquote expert on whatever.
Right.
A lot of people are more willing to listen to you. And there's not this sort of, well, he's a junior at the company, so, we don't have to, we can override him, that kind of thing.
Right. Makes a lot of sense to me. So let's talk, I want to talk Final Fantasy 12. What was the process going into this game? Like, what really did you add to the original? Because like you said, the original is out there, but I don't speak Japanese. I barely remember how to say hello. And I think the other phrase I know is, do you speak Japanese? But of course I don't, so it's kind of pointless to know how to say that. Thank you, Pimsleur Learning CDs. But
yes, yeah.
What exactly was the process going into Final Fantasy 12? Like, what was? I know you mentioned before in Vagrant Story they were all kind of just speaking normal Japanese, like kind of like a modern Japanese in this castle setting.
Yep.
What was Final Fantasy 12 like? Because I feel like that's a very similar game in some respects. It's kind of like a big medieval thing, but it's also like a
sure.
I don't know how to really describe the world of FF12 now that I'm actually trying to do so. It seems like more of a medieval kind of like Roman, like height of Roman Empire style world to me. So what went into your process for that game, and what did you add as your kind of like flavor and stuff like that?
Right. So this was me and Joe, and Joe definitely had a big role in determining the sound of FF12, and he also was perplexed by some of the casting decisions on FF10 and that kind of stuff, and the sort of mishmash, the cultural mishmash. And so one of the goals going into it was, no matter what, we're going to make everything make sense. The accent groups are going to make sense. Whatever is there, we're gonna think about it in terms of what would naturally exist in a world like this. And so that was one goalpost, and the other goalpost was we don't want it to sound like an anime dub, because at this point in the development of sort of Japanese media, anime and manga to a lesser extent were a big thing then in the U.S. And so and what that means in a sort of industrial or in an industry, on the industry side of things, you have a stable of voice actors who have cut their teeth on anime dubbings. And so they're used to that sort of high energy. A lot of anime are pretty goofy. And so there's this sound that you get with anime, and it's totally appropriate for anime, but we wanted something that was more realistic. And so those two things, it's got to be a natural sounding world, and it has to be realistic sounding. Like, we don't want super bombastic, over the top, cartoony, kind of performances. And so with those two things in mind, were really the guide to shaping how it would sound. And again, the Japanese is fairly uniform throughout the game. It's all modern Japanese, with some sort of faux archaic stuff going on with the judges. But which is understandable. But for the most part, it's everybody's speaking standard Japanese. And there's some differences in tone, like the Viera, the bunny women, have very deep voices. I'm sorry, very deep voices in Japanese, which is kind of cool and kind of sets them off, as it gives them a sort of distinct sound. And other than that, everyone's pretty much straightforward. There were a couple of interesting things that they did with the mocap. The motion capture actor for Balthier is actually a Canadian, and some not Japanese, like everyone else. And you can really tell, like, the way that he moves. If you keep that in mind, it's like, oh yeah, this guy's a total Westerner. He's got that swagger. He's got that just the way that he moves, and that's really cool. And so they did have an eye for keeping it a very sort of broad feeling game. They want you to feel like you're in a world, but that's where you get to just a fact about Japanese, which is Japanese is only spoken essentially, with the exception of a couple expat communities, in Japan. And within Japan, the range of Japanese goes, you've got standard Japanese in Tokyo, you've got Kansai dialect, which is the southern dialect in Osaka, and then you've got a bunch of regional accents, some of which get really, really heavily accented. It's sort of like, going to little towns in Britain or something, and you can't understand what anybody's saying. It's people from the deep south of Japan will have trouble understanding people from the north of Japan. If you take like an 80-year-old woman from Kyushu in the south and an 80-year-old woman from Aomori in the north, they may actually not be able to understand each other unless they purposely speak in the Tokyo dialect. So there is a wide range of accents, but those accents are very uniquely, they belong to Japan. And so you can't say, well, we're going to create this world of speech patterns, and if this people from this town are all going to speak like they're from Osaka, and people from this town, like what if the Vieira all spoke like they were from the deep north of Japan? It would have almost a comedic effect in Japan. It would be a very, very different feel than what you're going for. And so Japanese's only option is to go with sort of standard Japanese throughout. But conversely, if you're writing a game in English, you're creating a world in English, you have so much to draw on because English is spoken all over the world and in the real world. You have, American English, you have British English, you have all of the spin-offs of British English from the various, colonies, and then sort of even newer forms of English like Singaporean English, and obviously like Australian and New Zealand, those areas. And then English as it's spoken in European languages where English isn't in European countries where English isn't a primary language. So there's a lot more to draw on, and I think because English is so varied that if you have what's supposed to be an entire fantasy world and everybody's speaking one dialect of English, it's actually weird. You get a similar effect to when I was a kid watching Doctor Who, which was everyone had British accents. Even the slime aliens had British accents, and that seemed very funny to me as an American kid watching Doctor Who, right?
Yeah.
So in order to be realistic, I think we had to say, okay, this region is going to roughly correlate to this kind of English, and this region will correlate to this kind of English. And no wheels were reinvented. We went with the Star Wars model, there's more than one reason for that. I mean, obviously a lot of the story is inspired deeply by Star Wars.
Oh yeah.
And Balthier is very clearly Han Solo, and Fran, I guess, is Chewbacca. But
a little different dynamic between those two, but yeah.
Yeah, slightly.
I mean, I hope, but
but yeah, I mean, you get the idea, and so it makes sense to have Americans can be the rebels and British can be the Empire. That's fine. But what do you do about all the other kind of edge cases? And that's where things got pretty interesting. And also, you have to start considering things like what kind of voice you're going to get from voice actors if you give them certain directions. And so we had to tread a little carefully because there's this area in the game. Well, actually, be a little more specific about the accents. The American accent spoken in Rabanastre, of which Vaughn is like your primary example, is American English, but not modern American English. They're not talking like they're sort of California Valley Girls or even sort of East Coast types or Midwest. It's not. It's a standard, almost Mid-Atlantic accent from say like the 30s or so. In America. And so we actually used Leonardo DiCaprio Titanic as sort of the touchstone for that. And if it's something that he could say, then yeah, Vaughn could say that. That was sort of the idea.
They definitely took the hair too. They took the hair from DiCaprio and gave it to Vaughn as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that works too. And so the British side, we said, okay, well, it's going to be a certain level of Britishness. It'll be a certain sort of social class. And then for the judges, we knew we wanted to go more archaic. And so you can start having references like, okay, maybe these people are more in Lord of the Rings territory in the way that they speak. And one of the interesting ones was Bujerba, which is the sort of floating islands part of the world, which clearly has its own culture, but the story within the game is that it's a colony of the Empire. And so this is a place that had its own sort of rich, almost alien culture, and then was colonized by the Empire. So an obvious cognate is India, which obviously has its own rich history and culture, and then was colonized. And so they're speaking British, but there's a lot of their own language in it. And so to get Bujerban sounding right, for one thing, it's very, very risky to go into to a voice actor and say, give us an Indian accent, because 9 times out of 10 you're going to wind up with like a Pooh from The Simpsons,
right?
And which is not the vibe that we wanted for our game. And so what we ended up doing for Bujerba is we found reference dialogue from a Sri Lankan actor who was speaking in the sort of Sri Lankan dialect of English, and used that as a touchstone. And we had our primary, the Andor, we had, I think that's right, yeah. He became our touchstone for that accent. We had him act a bunch of lines, and then we used those and we showed those to the other actors who were doing Bujerban. And so his version of the Sri Lankan accent is Bujerban.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that from that area for sure.
And similarly, Fran, who is the Vieira and Balthier's sidekick, I think this was probably a joke call because he really loves Bjork. We're like, wouldn't it be cool if they're all Icelandic? And so we had her do, and also that's a good way of getting that sort of otherworldly feel to them. So we had Fran do the actress for Fran, who I'm blanking on her name actually, but she was in one of the Star Wars prequels. She did a great sort of Bjork impression, and then her accent became the touchstone for the Vieira.
Nice. Yeah, I was thinking earlier when you were talking about them giving the bunny women, the Vieira, a like deeper voice. I've always kind of had like drawn a connection between them, and I don't know if you ever watched Futurama at all, but sure. There's the Death by Snoo Snoo, that planet that they go to where it's like the women who basically like breed you to death is kind of the joke. And I just imagine them having that voice in Japan, like this like super deep voice for these really super tall people. And so I could see, I would probably laugh pretty hard if that's what they sounded like in the English one. But I think, yeah, I really like the style of that, and I can kind of see that. And to me, the Fran thing, and maybe this is because it was like a reference, they had like, all right, well, kind of make it sound like her. Sometimes it feels like with the rabbits, the Vieira in the game, like they're all kind of having like kind of a vague Nordic accent. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's because like there's varying abilities with the voice cast to be able to do that accent. And I definitely fall under that as well. Like every accent of mine eventually turns into the same accent. When I'm making an accent.
I mean, yeah, you're getting, obviously we couldn't ship in a bunch of Icelandic actors, so there are limitations. One thing that we didn't compromise on, and I think it really comes through in the game, and it was partially, what we were gunning for, but also luck of the draw, because our voice director, Jack Fletcher, who also, of course, had a huge influence on how that game sounds, and a lot of the choices that we made. So I should definitely give a shout out to Jack as well. He, can't be overstated, his influence on every aspect of how that game sounds. He had a lot of good connections with theater actors in the UK. And so we ended up, for almost all of the judges, recording them remotely from a soundstage in London. And many of them, it was their first video game work, or dubbing work in general. They were just stage actors. And we also did the same thing for the, I'm blanking on the name of the kind of the gods.
Oh, yeah, the Ocuria.
Yeah, the Ocuria, thank you. We did the same thing for the Ocuria as well. And the reason we were able to get away with that is, both because Jack had those connections, so he knew quality people with great voices for the judges in the Ocuria, but also because you cannot see the mouths of the judges and the Epicurean.
Oh.
So there's no, with one, I think there's like one or two exceptions where like a helmet comes off or something. But for the most part, we were doing, we were able to record them with just helmets, and with, and the Epicurean, of course, don't have mouths at all. They're just sort of floating, psionic beings or whatever.
Right.
And so we were able to record them wild, as it's called, where there's no like huge time limits, and there's no, stuff like that. And so,
yeah,
that was really useful.
That's kind of perfect for those guys, honestly, because they're all really great, which is
you get that great texture.
Yeah,
and just some of those performances were just fantastic, and we had taken great pains to, especially with the Epicurea, like the Epicurean are actually written in iambic. I think it's iambic pentameter, which is, Shakespeare is usually iambic quadrometer, the sort of, the rhythm of the, da-dun, 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 da-dun.
Right.
And we'd written it like that. And of course you give that to a stage actor and they know exactly what to do. And it's not, yeah. And so that stuff just worked beautifully. Like way, way more than we could have imagined. And the judges too, just great textures to their voices. Another thing, this is also really entirely Joe's insistence. One of his pet peeves was, and probably still is, he's still alive, the using women to voice boys.
Oh, yeah.
Where they use like 45-year-old women to, who pitch up their voices pitch down their voices and add a little gravel to do boys, because it's logistically and also just like cost wise, it's way more efficient to use an adult actor in the room to do pieces, both in terms of just professionality, stamina, what you're getting, that kind of stuff, and with anyone of school age, there's a lot of extra costs involved. You have to hire a tutor, you have to for a long recording, that kind of stuff. Because they can't miss school, those kind of things.
Right.
So that's why they do that. But we kind of insisted that our young characters, like Larsa, especially, and I think there's a couple other kids early on in the game. Those are actually all kids doing it. I think Larsa was actually like 12 years old.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and one of the other kids, we had like a 9-year-old in the booth and that kind of thing, and. Yeah, it was great, and it's super authentic.
I agree. Yeah, the Larsa, he sounds great. Yeah, all of them do. Even like the little kids, like the little like kites and all those little dudes that are hanging around.
Right, kite. Yeah. Those are like the kids of some of the other actors too.
Oh, really? That's cool.
Yeah, I think Kite is the son of Julia Fletcher, who was Drace.
Oh,
remember
okay.
any name of it? Yeah, Judge Drace. Yeah, and is Jack Fletcher's sister, and a fantastic actor. She's great.
Yeah, I liked her character. I think she's one of the ones you don't actually get to fight. So I think she gets like betrayed, or she gets executed by Gabranth, I'm pretty sure, or something like that.
There's a really that was extremely difficult to write scene where the three judges are kind of fighting. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of lips because Drace doesn't have a helmet on, and so you're seeing a lot of like lip flaps, and those scenes get really tricky.
Yeah, I bet. Oh man, that makes a lot of sense. I always thought the judges were like amazing, and the way they were written, like you said, it's kind of like a Shakespearean kind of like upper crust, like super classic style of English. And of course you get stage actors, and they act it perfectly because that's exactly what they do all day. Acting out these classic great plays. So I can see why it worked so well. And then you get the added benefit of like, well, they're all in helmets, so we can get whoever we want. We don't have to worry about any of that.
Yeah, it's quite difficult. You can probably pull it off now. I think a lot of recording is done remotely, obviously, especially in the last year and a half, 2 years,
right,
with the pandemic and all. But certainly at the time, and we're still using ISDN line to get the audio from the London stage, and yeah, it would have been very, very difficult to do lip syncing. I think we did one small section of a judge who had some unmasked scenes, and we had to do it lip synced, and we just did it basically blind, and read the guy the rhythm of his line, which you really don't want to do with an actor because you really want them to discover it themselves. But in this one specific case, I think we had to read a judge his line. I think I read it actually to match the lip flaps, and then he could act it however he wanted, but he had to match the rhythm of how I said it exactly, so it would fit the lip flaps that he couldn't see.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so
I bet
there's a lot of weirdness going on.
I bet you're going through reading the script and you're like, helmet comes off and you're like, God damn it again! Come on, man. You're like, it's easy when the helmets stay on.
Well, and the same thing in FF10, which I was learning how to do. It's called ADR writing, that writing to lip flaps, and I was learning that sort of on the job for FF10, and I remember, well, especially even FF10 too, there's some like Una speeches toward the end, and her mouth is like right in the camera, and you can see all the vowels she's making and stuff. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah, you're like, I'm sorry, I can't do anything else. Yeah, that's a thing, though. It's a thing, you know.
Yeah, we took a lot of the things that I learned from FF10 and FF10-2, we applied in FF12, like asking one of the restrictions for FF10. Another reason why, and 10-2, another reason why it's like amazing that it came out as well as it did, was we had to match the length of the Japanese sound files exactly.
Oh, wow.
And there was no room for, there's one part in FF10 where Yuna is saying something like, I know what I have to do now. I have to go down to Xanarkand, that sort of thing. And actually, I probably said it a lot faster than she says it in the game.
Yeah.
And there was no way of inserting any sound in between the times that she was moving her lips, because that would have involved adding in sound files and it would have blown up the game.
Yeah, now that you say that, I believe that, because there's times where I'm like, are you having like a stroke right now? Like, you're kind of going a little slow.
But even in the recording studio, we're like, we know this is ridiculous, but like, we're doing the best we can with the constraints of the game. And for FF12, I said, like, if there's any parts where anyone's talking to another person or there's any gaps, we need you to build the Japanese files big enough that we have wiggle room. So just make those Japanese files really big from the get-go, really long. Like one contiguous file is way better than triggering like 8 different little, 2-second or 1.5 second pieces. And then that gives us wiggle room. And so a lot of times the scenes, there's like a fast acting scene between, Gabranth and some dude in the Resistance, and they're having an argument, and one of them's talking, and he turns his back and starts walking away from the camera as he's talking. And then he turns around and says something else. And in Japanese, he actually stops talking when he's walking away, which is, good acting. You generally don't want to act with your back to the audience or back to the camera. Mm. But we really needed to fit in more stuff because we were limited in what we could say when you could see his lips. And so you cheat it by throwing in extra stuff when he's actually not saying anything at all in the Japanese.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's creative.
Yeah. So a lot of tricks like that.
Yeah, I remember that in 10, though. Like, there's times where Yuna is just like speed power talking, and then there's other times where she's like, I'm like, Yuna, are you?
Yeah, it's insane.
Are you doing okay?
I don't know. I think if knowing what I know now and with the experience and whatnot, we probably could have done a little better on some of those things, or, just kind of given up on some of them.
Yeah.
And not tried to like make one sentence that went like through all those huge kind of, you can drive a truck through them gaps. But yeah, I think for the time and for the resources that we had, and certainly, my level of experience, I'm pretty okay with how it came out. However, for 12 is one of the rare things I've worked on. We were talking about, looking at something you did years ago and thinking, oh man, if I knew what I knew now, like Vagrant Story, I would rewrite quite a lot of that if I had another chance at a stab at it. FF12, when I'm looking at it, like, I don't think there's anything I would change.
Yeah, I agree. Honestly, it's probably my favorite game, which is weird because it's one of the black sheep of the series. But it was
it's very not Final. I mean, it's not Final Fantasy.
Yeah, it's really Star Wars.
It's more like an MMO.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's like there's a weird like growth within Final Fantasy where they all kind of build off of each other. And 12 just had the unfortunate, situation where it came right after the MMO. So they're like, MMO, let's make it kind of an MMO, but single player. But I love it. I mean, I don't know. I think there's excellent depth, and I mean, even like side quests and stuff like that, like doing the hunts. Like, I feel like the writing in some of those hunts is better than like some of the writing in other games I've played. You've got one where it's like these kids, or like you hear a voice from the sewer and it's telling you to go grab something or something like that, and then you go fight it, and then you find out that it was the monster that like killed all these little orphan kids, and that's who was talking to you, like a bunch of dead orphans, and the item that you grabbed from the monster was like one of their belongings, and now they're basically able to leave this world, or they're at peace or whatever. And I'm like, man, there's some good stuff in here, and it's just like stuff on side quests. And most games are like, yeah, go here and just get this thing and then come back, and I'm like, there's actual depth here to even one of 50 or 45 hunt missions in the game. Like, so I've always been very impressed with all of that. And then it's one of the few games where there's a good story and also a fair bit of lore, where I've actually been kind of interested in the lore. A lot of times lore to me is for things that I'm like obsessed with. And there's games like Bloodborne or some of these other games that have come out where it's like, it's nothing but lore. And to me, I'm like, okay, that's not a story. Okay. You got to have a story and then throw the lore in for those who are like really nerding out on it, but you got to have that story first. And I think that's what FF12 did a pretty good job of. Admittedly, it is super Star Warsy, but I mean, Final Fantasy's been Star Wars since FF2, so
sure.
I mean, it's not like it's out of the realm of reality or within the series. Just 12 is just more so Star Wars.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's from the great era of Star Wars. It's it's episode 4. It's good stuff. So no problem there. Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, man, can't say enough good things about the FF12 voice acting. Maybe I'll have to try to get
super happy with that.
I'll have to try to get John in here too, or not John, Joe. Sorry, I was reading John on the computer. I'll have to get your Joe on as well and talk about some of this, hopefully.
I'd be interested to see. I don't know if he does podcasts, but I'd be interested to hear Joe's take on some of this stuff.
Yeah, I don't know either.
We haven't talked about it for years, but we definitely. I mean, we worked together for a long time after that. So
right,
and still work together today.
Nice. So what was the big reason? Like, what was? I know you went independent. What have you kind of done since then? Like, what's kind of been your? Did you do like a directional change? I know you've still done video games. Obviously, Final Fantasy 12 was one of them that you did after you went independent. But what was part of the reason why you did that, so that you could have like more range, you could work on more things as opposed to just video games? And how has that looked since then?
My initial impulse to leave Square was that I just felt like I could be doing more of the specific work that I was good at if I was freed of the sort of trappings of being an employee at a company. The fewer meetings I had to go to discuss sort of glossary lists, the better, basically. I realized it'd just be way more efficient, and I would be able to translate a lot more, and because which was my jam. And yeah, I just felt like I was kind of leaving opportunities on the table by by hanging out. Also, I mean, I was on FF11, which is an endless. I wouldn't be surprised if there's still updates to that game now. I don't know, but it seemed like an endless slog, and I'm like, am I going to spend the rest of my life doing FF11? I don't know. So that was another part of it for sure, and yeah, I mean, I think generally it worked out pretty nicely. I ended up doing a lot more games for Square, mostly the Matsuno games, and did a bunch of games for other companies, one of them being Capcom Phoenix Wright, which part of one of the Phoenix Wright games, I did the first one and the fourth one. So the part of that first one actually was concurrent with the beginning of the translation on Final Fantasy 12. I was actually working on both of them at the same time. But obviously Phoenix Wright's a much, much smaller game. And what else? I was moving back to the States for sort of personal reasons to help my parents out with some stuff, and had planned to move back earlier than I did, but Final Fantasy 12 got delayed, famously. And so I was kind of waiting around to work on FF12 before going back to the States. And then my wife and I had a child, and so we had to kind of wait until they were big enough. Or actually, it was a second child at that point. They were big enough to move back to the States. So the move back to the States was delayed, but one of the things in my mind was like, gee, when I move back to the States, it's going to be hard to work on games. So I should branch out and do novels. And so I started doing a lot of novel translation.
Nice.
And I ended up, I think, doing about 30 novels total before I put a pause on that that was a while ago now. 6 or 7 years ago, I think, was the last novel that I translated. But so I kind of branched out on that, and at the same time, I also started doing writing work. And so I think 2006 is when I started working for Wizards of the Coast, doing some world design work, some kind of behind the scenes work, writing short stories for some of their worlds, and writing a lot of card text, the names and the flavor text, which is the little story snippets or one-liners and stuff like that on the cards. And I'd been playing Magic since the very beginning, since like 94. So that was a great gig, a lot of fun. Did it for 3 or 4 years, maybe even longer than that. Actually, I kept kind of coming back to it. It's a very intense writing cycle because you're given a new set and you have to work on it, and it's competitive. You're competing with other writers to get your text chosen. So it doesn't play very well with other work. If you've got like a regular job going on, it's really hard to drop everything for 3 weeks or a month and like just totally focus on Magic card writing. So I would love to be able to do that again sometime, just because it was so much fun, and I had a good time doing it. But did that, and then started. I wrote a couple games. I did one with Joe. Did a big game for Square that ended up getting canceled. So we were on that for maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years. Actually, longer than that, 3 years or so. And also wrote sort of a treatment of a game for Capcom that also got Deep Sixed. So I spent like four or so lost years to that, and then wrote mobile game stuff for DNA, and then in 2000, when is this? It's about 5 years ago, so 2016, I guess, I joined Moon Studios, the makers of Ori and the Blind Forest, and at that time they were working on Ori and the Will-o'-the-Wisps. I was actually hired not to work on Will-o'-the-Wisps, but to work on their next game, which is still in production. But since I was the only sort of writer on the team when I joined, they're like, "Hey, help out with Will-o'-the-Wisps." So I ended up doing a lot of the writing. The story was sort of already baked in when I got there, but a lot of the scene specifics weren't determined yet, which is essentially like localization. The story's there, the characters are there, but like, what do they say? That's exactly the same question that you're answering when you're writing a localization script. So did a lot of the writing on that, and that shipped in 2020, early 2020. And then I worked with them on the next game for another year or so, and then more than that, maybe a year and a half. And then in September of this year, I actually joined Camouflage, which is the game company from Seattle. They made Republique. It was a mobile game. And then their latest release was an Iron Man VR game.
Oh, I actually own that. It came with my
Sweet
VR headset. So there you go.
Nice. So I'm working with them now.
Nice.
Which is great. And same general stuff as I was doing at Moon, essentially writing.
Right.
Doing story work and writing dialogue, that kind of stuff.
Very nice. Yeah, I was wondering, looking at your, since you're cool enough to get a Wikipedia page, it just
I
seems
haven't
like
looked at that in years. How's that looking?
Well, it looked like he hadn't done anything.
Stuff?
It looked like he hadn't done anything for a while, and I was like, it's like a big gap, and then there's the Wisp game, and then that's kind of it. So I was like, man, what's this guy been up to? But yeah, I mean, certainly, at least you're cool enough to have your own Wikipedia page. That's something I look forward to.
I actually tried to make an edit to that page. Because I discovered it after it was already mostly there, and I noticed that I was miscredited on one game. I'd been credited as the translator, and I really was just an editor on it. It's like Star Ocean 2, Star Ocean 3.
Yeah.
And I tried to change it, and they're like, "No, the credits of the game state you as a translator," so they rejected my edit because the credits actually were in error. But whatever.
Yeah, you're like, well, technically. They were wrong. But okay.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's how Wikipedia works, though. So.
Yeah. It's a great website, but I can see some of the faults. There was like something I can't remember what I falsely. It was a Wikipedia thing, and for years I would like falsely was freaking out about guy who directed the 7 remake. What is his name? I don't know why I'm drawing a blank. Like a big Kingdom Hearts guy.
Yeah. Nomura.
Nomura, yeah, Nomura. Yeah. For a long time, I was like, I don't get what the obsession with Nomura is. He's barely involved with Final Fantasy VII. Like all he did was the character designs, and it was based on something I read on Wikipedia. And then I clicked on the article and I read the article and I was like, this says the exact opposite. Like he did a ton for Final Fantasy VII. Like he was a big influence on major parts of the story. And then I was like, oh, okay, he should be in charge of the remake because he did a lot more than I thought because I based it off of what Wikipedia said. And then I, down below it's got like the reference list. I actually clicked on the thing and read it and I was like, okay, that's literally the opposite of what the guy, whoever edited the Wikipedia page, said. So I thought that was interesting. I of course didn't try to edit it because I was like, whatever. But it's funny how Wikipedia works sometimes. Like with that stuff.
I think overall it's great.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a great resource, definitely. And I think it's one of those things. So like the power of many, combining into one thing. It's like for the most part what actually happens or what actually occurred will probably filter through. You get enough people in there editing and doing things. Plus some of the funniest images I've seen online are like people messing with the a certain script on like the search windows and when you search it in Google.
Really. There's a great Instagram account called Depths of Wikipedia that uncovers a lot of like hidden gems on Wikipedia. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I can't remember what I was looking up or even what I found, but there was one that happened and like we were joking about something, and as I pulled it up, like that was in the you Google it and then the Wikipedia article comes up, and when you hover over it, the little snippet that it shows, like it was exactly what we were just talking about, and we were dying. For the life of me, I can't remember what it was, but it was totally random. And it doesn't have to be affiliated with the article at all. and people just like throw those little gems in there. So it's a good time. It's a good time on that site. Well, awesome. I'm glad to hear that you're still doing stuff. That's what I was kind of worried about. I was like, man, it seems like it's been a minute. And then you mentioned that to me as well when I reached out on Twitter for the localization stuff. So I'm glad to hear that things are going well, and you're still doing stuff. It's good to keep busy, and I could see the artist in you coming out with like, yeah, I'm going to quit Square, but I'm totally going to work for them or with them, but I don't really like working for them. That's always been one of those big things with the artist types. My co-host for the Final Fantasy show and for this show as well, he's that way too, and so sometimes I have to like take a step back and realize, oh no, he works because he has to. He does other things that aren't art because he has to, or else he wouldn't at all do that. And you've gotten to the point where it seems like you can do both of those in one, which is quite an impressive feat. Not very many people get there, obviously. So,
well, I definitely love what I'm doing, and super happy right now at Camouflage. We're working on really exciting stuff, and can't wait till it's out there in the world. We can talk about it.
Yeah, that'll be cool to see. It'll be interesting to see what happens, and we'll see what you bring out next. I mean, no localization, so I can't be super pumped about that. But if you're helping with the writing or helping with whatever, I mean, I'm sure it'll bring some great insights to those guys. So, well, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. It's always kind of a beast to get interviews. It's always something I've become more and more interested to do over time. But obviously, you guys are always super busy. Everyone's super busy, and I have like an awful time frame to record and do things. But luckily, being on the other side of the world makes it kind of easy for you. You wake up, have your morning coffee, and then bam, perfect timing. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for what you've done for the Final Fantasy games. Like, it really does make a difference. And I know that I kind of bagged on 10 a little bit, but
bag away.
Yeah. Honestly, I do think a lot of it is the voice cast. Not that they're bad. I mean, James Arnold Taylor's great, but man.
Oh yeah, man. They're all super talented. It's just working within the constrictions that they had to work in, and the just from the get go, the whole envisioning of the voice for FF10, where they voiced absolutely everything. So it's so huge, that project.
Yeah.
It was very ambitious.
For sure. And there's more voice acting in that, I'm pretty sure, than there is in 12, like total. I would imagine, because there's a lot of text in 12, but not that that's a problem. Yeah, but because that's how most games are.
Yeah,
like
well,
you
no,
said,
we actually had a good amount of time to do that too. We had, in fact, I feel like we spent something like 6 or 7 months on the voice script alone, which represented something like, this is off the top of my head, but it was less than 10% of the entire game.
Oh wow!
Text volume.
Jeez, yeah.
And then we just jammed through the rest of it, but still had enough time to spend time on things like the bestiary and that sort of background lore content, which we had just the great opportunities to kind of do what we wanted with that stuff, because a lot of it was very dry and straightforward in Japanese.
Yeah, and that was another thing that I forgot to bring up. There's a lot of deep lore hidden in those little entries, like kill enough of these snakes and we'll tell you about the world.
Right.
That was something I also appreciated. I probably didn't get into it as much as I could have, especially considering I took the time to fill the damn thing.
Right.
But yeah, there's so much detail in that game, and I mean, I've played through it like 5 times now, and I've done everything in it twice, which is really saying something, because that is a long freaking time to do.
Don't believe Andor's lies.
Yeah. Oh man, classic moment. There's actually a YouTube video before we end this. Sorry, of like a kid, some guy who's like at a supermarket and he's saying that, and then he says that to this huge like redneck kind of guy who's got his kids there, and he's got the little Vaughn vest on and everything, and the guy's like, "Stay away from my family." And then he's like threatening the dude, and he's like, "Don't listen to Ondor's lies," and he's like kind of chasing him off. It's a super funny little YouTube video. But I really appreciate the work you've done, the work you and your partner in crime, your co-host Joe, have done for some of these games. It really does stand out, and it's not something I normally really even think about in games. But when I, going through the series, it's like, no, now it's like really well done, and it was almost night and day. After you became involved, honestly, with like translation and stuff like that. Obviously some rough patches there in 7, 8, 9 a little bit. But 10 on, I think the translation is very well done, and it's, it leaves less, there's less like consumption of side material that just surprises the hell out of me. Like, oh, this guy was dead, right? And then it's like, oh, no, not dead. So there's a lot less to be missed now that you guys since you guys were involved in those middle games.
Yes, well, Square definitely upped their game, and then I think the industry as a whole matured somewhat.
Oh yeah,
it's still got a ways to go, but
yeah,
it definitely got better.
You can see it with voice acting too. I mean, you look at something like Symphony of the Night or Resident Evil 1, and you're like, oh, man, did they just get like
classics?
Yeah. Like, who did they get to do this? It's probably just the guys that made the game, or like.
Yeah, well, is audioatrocities.com still live? If you haven't heard of it, you should go there and treat yourself if it still exists, because that place is amazing. In fact, I kind of had it as a goal for years to get something that I worked on Audio Atrocities, but I don't think it ever happened.
It is still alive. Oh man, yeah. There's Resident Evil.
It's great. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening listening to some of the tracks from this thing.
Yeah,
look at that.
I swear, some of the scenes from Symphony of the Night were recorded in like a bathroom, like a large bathroom. Like, guys, come on.
There's all kinds of great material in there. It's glorious. I'm glad that all that happened. Honestly,
yeah, it really is. It does have a serious charm to it, for sure. Yeah. But yeah, again, I appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we can maybe do this, again in the future. See what you've been working on from now until whenever that happens, and really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy your evening.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah!